welcome to American Catholic History, brought to you by the support of listeners like you. If you value this content, please become a supporter at americancatholichistory.org/support. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crowe.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Today we're talking about the Barber family, a prominent family of fine, upstanding Protestants who shocked Revolutionary War era New England by becoming Catholic. But first, we start with a word of thanks to our supporters.
Yes, we want to highlight some of the people who make this work possible. Stephen, George A., and Andrew J. are among our most recent new supporters. Thank you so much. Your support helps make this podcast possible. We hope many others will check out americancatholichistory.org/support to become a supporter. Or, and this one costs nothing, go to your podcast provider and give us a 5-star rating and a great review. Those especially help us out by helping others to find us.
Yes, thank you for your support. We hope to keep earning your trust and support. But now, on to our topic. As we said, the Barbers were a family of Protestants in New England, but they shocked Protestant New England when they converted to Catholicism in 1817 and 1818. The story of how this came about is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, becoming Catholic wasn't the thing you did out of convenience or for social status back then. You only converted if you were convinced that it was true and your conscience forced you to follow the truth.
Well, that was the case with this family. So many members became Catholic, and most of them even took the step of entering religious life.
The father of the family, and the first whom we'll talk about, was Daniel Barber. He was born in 1756 to a Puritan Congregationalist family in Connecticut. He signed up to fight with the Continental Army in the War for Independence, eventually being discharged and going home due to injuries and illness. He became a Congregationalist minister, but eventually he became an Episcopal priest.
He actually baptized Fanny Allen, the daughter of Revolutionary War hero Ethan Allen, while he was an Episcopal priest. Fanny Allen herself eventually became Catholic and was a cloistered nun, and we also have her incredible story to tell.
But as for Barber, the reason he became Episcopalian was significant. It started when he took part in some debates with Episcopalians about what it meant to be a minister. Barber, still a Congregationalist Puritan, believed that all baptized Christians had the same sort of ministry by virtue of their baptism. None are set aside in any special way to preach, bless, and sanctify. Those who become preachers simply, chose to make teaching and preaching their job. Any ordination ceremony involved was nothing more than a designation that this person will do nothing but teach and preach. The ceremony itself imparted no special graces or anything else.
The Episcopalians, on the other hand, argued that there was something different about the ordained priesthood. They insisted that ordination changed something about the person. The ordained priesthood was different in character from the priesthood of all believers. They further argued that apostolic succession mattered. That is, it matters that the one doing the ordaining stands in direct succession from the apostles. And, of course, they are able to point to Scripture and tradition to support this position.
Yeah, and this argument unsettled Barber. He realized that the evidence of Scripture and tradition backed it up. He took his concerns to his peers and his elder colleagues. None could answer. Most just said, well, that question has been settled. We don't talk about it. Well, that didn't sit well with him. He was too honest and intentional about his Christianity to let such an important question just sort of slide by. Convinced that ordination and apostolic succession matter, he became Episcopalian in 1783 when he was 27. And then in 1787, he was ordained an Episcopal priest.
Now, his wife apparently went along with his change in faith, because we can't find any record that she did anything else. Daniel's wife was the former Chloe Chase. Daniel and Chloe had married shortly after the Revolutionary War was over. Chloe was the widow of a good friend of Barber's who had died in the war. Daniel and Chloe Barber had 3 sons and a daughter at the time when he was ordained an Episcopal priest. Life was going well for them. After his ordination, the family moved to Claremont, New Hampshire, where a congregation awaited him. And things went smoothly for the Barbers for many years. One of Daniel's sons, Virgil, who was born in 1782, eventually got married, and he also became an Episcopal priest.
The first inkling that further upheaval might be coming for the Barbers came in 1812. That year, Daniel came upon the writings of an English Catholic bishop named John Milner. Milner had written about Anglican orders, arguing that Anglican orders did not enjoy apostolic succession. Barber found Milner's argument convincing.
And that was rather inconvenient.
I know, right?
It meant that the argument which convinced Daniel Barber to become Episcopalian was suddenly suggesting he might need to become Catholic. He was so sure the Episcopalians had had the right idea, and, well, we agree they did have the right idea, but they simply didn't realize or accept that the reality of their own ordinations and apostolic succession didn't meet the requirements that they themselves insisted upon.
Right. The crux of the matter for Anglican and later Episcopalian ordinations goes back to the reign of Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII. Edward only reigned a short time, from 1547 to 1553, but during his reign the Church of England issued a new rite of ordination. This new rite changed enough of the language, and it had a new understanding of what a priest and a bishop is, that no man ordained with it was actually ordained, sacramentally. Now, to be sure, the bishops who worked with Edward to issue this new rite were validly ordained Catholic bishops, but when they accepted Henry VIII as the supreme head of the church in England, they put themselves into schism. They excommunicated themselves from the Catholic Church. So while that last set of Catholic-turned Anglican bishops were truly bishops and stood in the line of the apostles, that line ended with their death. It did not continue within the Anglican religion.
Many years after Barber's death, Pope Leo XIII made all of this clear in his 1896 papal bull, Apostolic Succession. He went into the arguments in detail and ultimately declared Anglican orders absolutely null and utterly void.
Not much wiggle room there.
No.
But Apostolic Succession wasn't available for Daniel Barber to read. He had the explanation of Bishop Milner, and that was enough to get him questioning.
Barber took his questions to other Episcopal priests and bishops. None could provide an explanation. Few even tried. Later that year, 1812, he was in Boston for an Episcopal conference, and while there, he made a point to visit the Catholic Bishop of Boston, the learned and well-respected Frenchman Jean-Louis Chevreul.
Chevreul, whose story we told in another episode, was only too happy to receive Barber. They talked on many points of doctrine, including the nature of orders. Chevreul did what every great spiritual teacher does. He sent Barber away with arms full of books on the questions asked. Barber accepted them gratefully and took them back to Claremont. He studied them carefully, and he shared them with his family, including with his son Virgil and Virgil's wife Jerusha.
But his family seemed to take no note, even acting annoyed at his constant questioning. I mean, I kind of can't blame them.
Yeah.
The leaders of his congregation, however, took a more strident position. They demanded he get rid of the offensive papist books. Barber didn't agree to get rid of them, but he did agree to keep the books to himself, and he locked them up.
But the wheels were set in motion. It would take another 6 years for his conscience to act on the implications. After all, he had good friends. His position was comfortable. He had a wife and children to consider. But the wheels were most definitely in motion.
What finally pushed him to accept the reality was his son's actions.
Yes, his son Virgil, who again was also an Episcopal priest, became the head of a good school in Waterbury, Connecticut. One day he randomly came upon a small novena booklet about St. Francis Xavier. A young Irish servant girl who worked in his home had left it lying around.
And we need air quotes here, randomly.
Yes, I'm sure she got in very big trouble for being so careless.
I'm sure her guardian angel and Virgil's guardian angel, well, they arranged this carelessness.
Yeah, probably. Virgil was inspired by the great Jesuit missionary. He took the story of Francis Xavier to his wife and to his fellow Episcopal clergy, exclaiming that Protestantism had never produced anyone like him. All were annoyed by his renewed vocal fondness for Catholicism.
Virgil continued studying the question, and his wife, a very well-educated woman, kept up with him and would debate with him the points of theology.
And finally,
a good wife there.
Yeah, worked out for both of them. Finally, Virgil went to see his bishop, John Henry Hobart. Hobart at first wouldn't take Virgil seriously. He only barely tried to refute Barber's arguments or to answer his points. After some length of conversation, Virgil was standing silently in thought near an open window. In through that window came the strains of music from a nearby Catholic church. Virgil turned to Bishop Hobart and asked, referring to the Catholics, "Do you think that those can be saved?" Bishop Hobart smiled and responded, quote, "They have the old religion, don't you know? But they do too much, and one can be saved without so much trouble. Go back home in peace, and if you choose to do so, consult your brother ministers, and your religious scruples will soon vanish away."
What a thing to say.
Yeah, not a lot of, conviction there.
I know. Don't worry, it'll all go away, all your concerns.
Yeah. I mean, instead of pursuing truth and embracing the cross, Bishop Hobart's advice was more or less to just stop thinking so deeply and go back to live in comfort.
Yeah. Well, that didn't sit really well with Virgil, and he had, too much integrity. The next thing to move his conscience was the story of Father Anthony Coleman and the Seal of Confession. Father Coleman was pastor of St. Peter Church in New York City. In 1813, he heard the confession of a man who had stolen something. The prosecutors knew who the thief was, and they took him to court to force him to tell them. He refused, citing the inviolability of the Seal of Confession. Eventually, the mayor of New York City sided with Father Coleman, and the Seal of Confession was protected.
Again, the example of a Catholic priest willing to give up his comfort and his freedom.
Going back to his observation about how Protestantism hadn't produced a St. Francis Xavier.
Exactly. Then, finally, in 1816, Virgil went to visit Father Benedict Fenwick, who was Vicar General of New York at the time. Fenwick would eventually become the second Bishop of Boston. Father Fenwick received Virgil and helped him through his many questions. And by the end of their sessions, Virgil and his wife, Jerusha, were received into the Catholic Church in 1816.
This dramatic step meant leaving behind the posh position he'd enjoyed. But Fenwick invited the Barbers, Virgil and Jerusha, to found a school in New York City. They happily accepted. By the way, we still have Protestant ministers today who very much understand this feeling that they had. When Virgil and Jerusha moved into their new home, they discovered that their next-door neighbor was none other than Bishop Hobart, his former boss. That had to be awkward.
I bet he loved it, yeah. So 1817 brought more converts. That year, Daniel Barber and his sister, Abigail Tyler, went to visit Virgil and Jerusha in New York. While there, they met the Dominican priest, Father Charles French, with 2 F's, I love that spelling, who was in residence at St. Peter. Abigail had been interested in Catholicism for a while, and this visit with Father French clinched it. Before they left New York, Abigail had become Catholic. Later that year, Father French accompanied Virgil and Jerusha on a trip to Daniel's home in Claremont, where Father French offered Mass and gave a series of talks. By the end of the talks, Chloe Barber, Daniel's wife, herself became Catholic, as did their 2 other children, their daughter Laura and their son Trueworth. Daniel was the last holdout at this point.
Yeah, and he would last until sometime in 1818, when his obvious movements toward Catholicism made the leaders of his church vote for his dismissal on November 12, 1818. 3 days later, he gave his tear-filled final sermon. He went for a time to stay with the Jesuits in Maryland.
And where did he visit them?
Well, at St. Inigo's, which is way down near the end of the Potomac River. It's just downstream of historic St. Mary's City. The Church of St. Francis Xavier, the oldest continuously used Catholic church in the original 13 colonies, is there. That church is on the itinerary when we take pilgrims to Maryland and Virginia, along with some of these other sites we just mentioned. The region is beautiful and just so filled with Catholic history.
It is. It's wonderful. So during this stay with the Jesuits at St. Inigo's, Daniel Barber finally accepted his life's trajectory, and he too became Catholic.
Daniel was in his 62nd year when he became Catholic. After this, Daniel and Chloe lived near Virgil, helping him in a number of pursuits, including establishing the first Catholic parish in New Hampshire. Daniel's wife Chloe died in 1825, and Daniel spent the rest of his life living in Jesuit communities in Maryland and Pennsylvania.
He never pursued the Catholic priesthood, saying that he had taught too many heresies in his younger days to be worthy of that calling.
But the buzz continued among Episcopalians who were shocked to see this entire family of respectable, upstanding, educated Episcopalians, including 2 priests, become Catholic. The conversion of the Barbers caused a ripple throughout the Episcopal community for decades.
Daniel Barber died in 1834 in St. Inigo's, where he was buried. His last words were, "I have lost nothing."
There are 2 postscripts on this story. The first concerns the family of his sister Abigail. Most of her family, including her husband and all their children, also became Catholic. Their son, William Tyler, was eventually consecrated the first bishop of Hartford, Connecticut in 1843. 4 of their daughters became Sisters of Charity.
The other postscript is about Virgil, Jerusha, and their children, and this one's weird. Both Virgil and Jerusha eventually entered religious life, and the children, who were still kind of young, were raised by the church. It's a crazy story that we may talk about in a future episode. Suffice to say, the Barber family, through their fidelity to truth and devotion to duty, had a significant and lasting impact on the church in this country.
But as for Daniel Barber, if you ever travel in southern Maryland, try to stop and pray at his grave in St. Inigo's. Pray for the repose of the soul of one of the most interesting early converts in the church in America. This has been American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic History, please become a supporter. We've got great perks for supporters. Get information on how to become a supporter and the perks at americancatholichistory.org/support.
Also on our website, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about the Barber family, see about our upcoming pilgrimages, and find other great stories from American Catholic history.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those and the 5-star ratings help others find us. You can also email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, or other comments at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/American Catholic History, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on Twitter at ACH1513. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Thank you once again for joining us on American Catholic History, made possible by listeners like you.